Stop procrastinating and start doing. Well, if you find you procrastinate, in this film I want to help you to identify what makes you procrastinate and what you can do about it. Procrastination is a very active state of inactivity. It involves conflict, active avoidance and fear. So let's get motivated to do something about it. There are a number of paths to procrastination, as we'll call the process of putting something off, and I want to talk about three. These are low tolerance of frustration, perfectionism, and emotionalizing. And then I want to give you some help in overcoming these. In the first instance, I want to talk about low tolerance of frustration. This means that you don't do something because you feel it will be hard and you won't be able to do it. It's a bit like giving up before you start. The other side of this is that when something untoward happens, you feel you can't cope with it. And of course you can see where this leads. Giving up before you start only ever leads to one outcome: you don't do it. And yet of course you do things. It's the old school or college assignment syndrome. Do you remember putting off an assignment at school or college, work or anywhere else for that matter? You only do it when the deadline and the fear of failure looms so close that the fear of failure from not doing it overwhelms the fear of failure from doing it. And if you identify with these forces in yourself, you'll see that you're balanced on a knife edge of fear. You might recall that feeling of being paralyzed with immobility. On the one hand, the fear that you won't be able to do it well enough, and on the other hand, the fear that you'll fail if you don't do it. Another way that you might self-sabotage is to tell yourself that you can't do something. And once again, this is a very common habit that I come across often in clinical practice. You tell yourself you can't do something often enough, and it'll take on the characteristic of the truth. I'm sure that you see what the problem with this habit is. And yet, as always with cognitive therapy, we're looking at what really happens, not what you imagine happens. And if we rely solely on imagination, everything would pretty much seem a disaster. Okay, so you pretty much always do the things that you need to do. You do it because you're able to do it. But you're hampered by the prospect of not being able to do it. In other words, you fear that you will fail. So let's reinforce this point. You do it. You don't fail very often at all. I know this because you're taking the time to watch these films, etc. If you genuinely failed, you wouldn't care nearly so much. So look, the point is you do it. You are able to do it. But you might feel stuck in some way. So I call this a double bind. So you're kind of stuck in a double bind. Fear of failing by doing it, and then fear of failing by not doing it. Looks and feels painful. You can stay stuck for a long time, but eventually you knuckle down and you take some action. Now I'm helping you to change your life for the better, and I want you to do it, but you may keep telling yourself that you can't do it. And once again we have this knife-edge balance of you want to do it, but the fear of failure. On the other hand, the fear of failure might happen if you do it. Keep you kind of stuck. Fear again. Now, very frustrating, I would imagine. You may be very frustrated with yourself, and couldn't you just kick something? Procrastination is not just avoidance, remember. It's an active tussle going on inside you that causes real stress. Okay, the next trigger for procrastination is perfectionism. Many people will recognize this in themselves, elements of perfectionism anyway. It's a very powerful driver of success, but taken too far, of course, it becomes a burden. Anything driven too far becomes a burden. Many successful people often have an element of perfectionism, so it's not necessarily a bad thing having high standards and wanting to do things well, but with many psychological characteristics, taking it too far causes it to be a problem. The strong version of perfectionism is the need to do things well, otherwise they're a failure. This is a black and white view of things. It's perfect or it's a failure. If any task's a bit complex, or the instructions are ambiguous, or it's perceived as beyond your ability to control it adequately, and so be pretty well assured of a perfect job, you're very unlikely to want to do it. Therefore, we put it off, and hence procrastination. The final cause of procrastination I want to speak about is what I'll call emotionalizing. This is allowing your feelings to be stronger than is beneficial to achieve your outcomes. An example is waiting to feel inspired or excited, or on the other side, predicting it's going to be terrible. Allowing your emotions to have a lot of territory is often not useful if you want to make real changes in your life. Feelings are a poor guide to reality. As much as anything else in your life, emotions are a habit. If you have practiced the feeling of particular emotions, if you've practiced having particular emotions, then you're going to have more access to them. Emotions tell you very little about reality, so it's best not to let them have very much space in making decisions. A lot of the time, anyway, if you're able to do that. So now I'm going to offer 2 strategies for managing procrastination. The first solution is to take a step backwards and take yourself out of the whole process a bit more. What this means is that if you draw an imaginary line through your body so that it comes out of your tummy and stretches off in front of you, into your future, and then does the same out of your back into the past, and then imagine the thing that you procrastinate about you is very close to your tummy on that white line, then it's very close to you. And this means that it feels like a very present problem, very in your face. Now, even though you may try to avoid it, so we have to move it further away, step back in essence. You've got to get some distance from it. So one way to get some distance from it is to take that metaphorical step back. Imagine you're moving yourself 3 steps back to see the big picture, as I like to say. You need to imagine the problem moving farther away from you down that line, just so you've got some distance from it. So the greater you engage your imagination for this exercise, the better. Now, distance is a very useful tool when you're trying to make things less of a problem. So imagine this white line, okay? You have your problem in your face. You move the problem down the white line by actually physically imagining the picture that you see of yourself completing this task. Move it further away so that it feels less in your face, it feels less present, and therefore it has less emotional intensity associated with it. You can use this for virtually every situation, really, where you might experience some procrastination. The white line on the road is the example I give here, but basically it's moving it off into the distance. It's imagining seeing yourself in the distance. It's giving some distance between you and the problem. It takes the heat out of it. It takes the emotion out of it. It simply makes it one of the many hundreds of things you do every day. Very little in life is life and death, and you have the ability to do things well enough to get on with it without ramping the things up to be a major crisis. So put the problem on the line, move the problem down the line, just imagine it moving down the line further away from you. It's not a success or failure thing, it's simply the process of starting to move it down the line, doing a little bit and seeing what happens. Move the idea of life and death, success or failure further away and it becomes less problematic. Use your imagination as best you can to do this. Even a little bit will give you a little bit more space between yourself and the problem, which will give you a breather to be able to engage your rational mind. There are many different metaphors for moving things away, moving it down the line, move it down the path, but you get the idea. Move it out of your face, that's the important point. Now, as we move the problem further away, we have to deal with the next bit, and that is the inner critical voice. So, locate the voice that tells you that you can't do something well enough. Recognize the voice. Give it a name. It may be something like neggy or negative voice or critic or devil on my shoulder or moaning Minnie or anything you like. Sometimes critical voices belong to people who've criticized you in the past. At other times they don't. It doesn't matter so much at this point. It's simply important to recognize the voice and give it a name. Now figure out for yourself what that voice tells you about yourself. Well, I'll never be able to do this. If I do this, I'll get laughed at. I can't stand doing this. It'll turn out to be rubbish. Just all sorts of different things. And you will have habitual figures of speech statements that you will make to yourself. I'm not succeeded in doing it before, I might as well give up now. I know what's going to happen. Can you see how the inner critic destroys your feeling of being able to do things? the sense of achievement gained from doing things is destroyed by the inner critic. You're no good, you're rubbish, the inner critic says. But of course it's not true. Now, I often talk about habits of thought. The brain likes habits because it saves on energy. Not having to think about everything 100% every time you do it saves the brain a lot of power, a lot of energy. So it's always going to want to follow established patterns. It will always do what it's always done. Unless you change something, you'll always get the same outcome. So you need to challenge the inner critic. Stop listening to it. Don't listen to the inner critic. Just tell the inner critic, no, I'm not going to listen to that right now. Exercise more control over it. The inner critic easily crumbles when you challenge it. No. And there the inner critic diminishes. Recognize the inner critic is not normally challenged. Challenging it is a very powerful intervention. Now, applying a little effort, even only a little, reaps great benefits in terms of feeling more in control over what you've got to do and how you feel about it. And when you feel like putting something off, when you have one of those, you'll have these two strategies and you can keep practicing with them. And then you'll feel stronger and stronger about what you have to do. Now remember, the secret of a good journey is to travel well. Traveling well is the process of managing your inner world so that you get the outcomes you want. Put problems further down the line, move them away from you so you've got some thinking space, and challenge the inner critical voice, and that enables you to have a good journey and therefore travel well.